many, many great stories about young Alexander. Taming of Bucephalus is a great one. This is his horse, Bucephalus, which he got when he was 9 years old and had all the way to the end of his life. So Bucephalus was a very senior citizen horse when he passed away. He died in India, so it was towards the end of the Alexandrian story, and they buried him in a beautiful container in a lake in India, and that lake is still there, and the name for that lake is his name. In the story of the horse, a friend of Philip had brought this beautiful horse, one of the most beautiful horses anybody had ever seen, to sell to Philip. And when the man brought the horse to Philip, the horse was very, very skittish and jumping and jumping and jumping and moving around. And Philip said, well, what's the point of my buying a horse if I can't ride it? And so the men were all laughing and saying, well, you're king of Macedon. You should be able to ride anything. And Alexander, who was 9, standing right there next to his father, spoke up and said, I can ride him. He was 9, and he was small. And so all the men, of course, taunted him and laughed at him and said, no, you can't, no, you can't. And Philip was very embarrassed because here the men were making fun of his son. And so Alexander just reached down and grabbed the reins, because that's all the horse had. He just had, and moved him back. And what he had seen, what he realized, was the horse was being made skittish by his shadow, the way the sun was flipping back and forth. Animals, will pick up. And so he was jumping from it. And so Alexander just moved him right so the sun was, behind them, and then grabbed the reins and just jumped on top of the horse and rode him off. Just rode him down the road, super, super fast pace, out of sight. Just disappeared. And all the men just stood there and thought, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. Well, Philip was so moved by this, 9-year-old that he was crying by the time the kid came back with the horse and jumped off the horse. And of course, he had the horse with him for the rest of his life. The horse adored him. And when Alexander came back and stood and looked at his father said, Macedon will be too small for you. You'd better get yourself a bigger state, which, of course, he was going to do, was get a much bigger state. The story of Alexander and his best friend Hephaestion, Hephae, Hephaestion. Of course, a lot of us know the story. They were lifelong friends. They start out as young friends here and as kids. He's also from the aristocracy of Greece. And so he will be with Philip and with Alexander all his life. Both of them study with Aristotle from 340. What is the year? Say it to me. 343 to 340. So for 3 years, the young men, they're teenagers, study with Aristotle, the greatest scholar at that moment. Everybody was already beginning to understand how great a Greek philosopher he was. And so the two young men now were growing up at his feet, studying with him. In 338, Philip announced he was going to remarry. Now, these kings often had more than one queen or one wife. And so what he was doing was marrying a second time. It would be like his 4th time, I think. But it was very bad news for Olympias and Alexander, because if another wife produced a son, then there'd be a dispute over who would be the successor. Normally it would have been Alexander. He was his oldest son. He would have normally succeeded. But there was always potential for trouble. And at this sort of drunken stag party that they held for Philip to celebrate him getting a new young bride, Alexander and Hephaestion came, which sounds like trouble, doesn't it? And they all drank themselves into a stupor, particularly Philip. Philip was a big drinker. And one of his friends was boasting and sort of taking over the event and shouting, and so they said, well, it's wonderful that you're getting married now to a nice young woman, and then you can produce a legitimate heir. And of course, the Alexander in the room leapt across the room at this man, ready to strike him, shouting, "So what does that make me, a bastard?" And as this contretemps took place, Philip lunged at his son across the room, and as he did, he fell on his face right in the middle of this room with everybody watching. And Alexander walked over and said, "Look at that. He plans to cross to Asia and conquer all the East, and he can't even cross the room," and marched out the door and went and got his mother, and they left. They left Macedon and went to her royal headquarters in Epirus. So that there was now a big break between the royal family, between Olympias and Philip, and for the next 2 years they were out of Macedon. Then in 336, Philip asked them to come back to Macedon, to the capital, to be present for a wedding of Alexander's half-brother. This had been born to another wife, not a person who was ahead of him in the line. Asked them to come back for the wedding for this young man, and they did. And when the wedding celebration was going to unfold here in this theater in the capital of Macedon, and Philip marched in with gods and goddesses preceding him, and then he came in as the supreme god with an entourage of soldiers. A man came rushing out of the crowd, part of his bodyguard, his name was Pausanias, and plunged a knife right into Philip's heart, and he died immediately in front of everybody. So assassination on the stage in the theater with everybody seeing it. And within days, Alexander was proclaimed king of Macedon. He was 20 years old. So 336, age 20. Of course, now people write books and articles. Was Alexander or Olympias behind this? We know quite a bit about Pausanias. We know quite a bit about his story, and he had his own reason for wanting to kill Philip. And I think that's why he did it. I don't think that it was some plot with Alexander. I'm sure that Olympias didn't shed any tears over his passing, but I also don't think Alexander was involved. But many, of course people thought about it, of course people wondered about it, and so of course there were questions about whether or not. I don't think there was anything in Alexander's nature to motivate him to kill his own father. I just don't think that that's the kind of person he was. And so now in 336, Alexander was the king of Macedon. He was 20 years old. He had a huge treasury. He had a huge territorial state. He had a spectacular army. And now he announced his intention to go to Asia Minor. Now, this wasn't a big controversial act because there had been war between Greece and Persia that controlled Asia Minor for 100 years. So it wasn't unusual for a Greek leader to talk about going and facing the Persians. And so that's what the beginning of this is. It's Alexander taking his army into Asia Minor, as his father had already talked about doing. So at this point, there's no world conquest plan, no world conquest discussion, no world conquest idea. That wasn't the idea. Why would 100,000 Greek troops go with him? That's the big question. First of all, his person and his leadership was so extraordinary. He had a kind of magic with his troops. And in the beginning, thousands and thousands of them wanted to go with him on this adventure. Nobody knew where they were going yet. Nobody talked about where they were going yet. He hadn't told. And so in the beginning, it's Asia Minor. And, of course, it starts by crossing the Hellespont, the Dardanelles on our map. It's that little narrow channel Some places it's only like a couple of miles, even less than a mile wide at the most narrow. Most of the places about 2 miles wide and about 20 to 30 miles long. It's just a very, very narrow strip of water that connects all the inland lakes, Black Sea, Caspian Sea, to the Mediterranean. And as, of course, has always been the critical piece of water that separates Asia from Europe. Everybody knew that. Everybody talked about it. We already discussed Darius, the Persian emperor, in 500 BC, taking a Persian army across the Hellespont, across the Dardanelles, all the way to Athens. Well, now Alexander was doing the reverse. Alexander was going to do just exactly the opposite. He was bringing his army, but a very tight, well-disciplined, well-trained army that marched with him and knew where they were going and were dedicated to their leader. Remember, he's only 20 years old, so this is magic. He has infinite energy. He fights in the front with the troops. He leads from the front. And so that is part of his magic. So 334, that's the date of the beginning of the whole expedition that will last to 333. So 334 to 333, so 11 years, during which Alexander essentially conquers much of the known world, certainly all of the Mediterranean and the Middle East into India and Afghanistan. The first thing that you're going to think about is, how do you do this? Even if you have 100,000, that doesn't seem like much when you're out in the world going into countries with populations of millions. Well, remember, he was going to add to his troops as he traveled and as he won. So as this particular army moved into a territory and won, there were new adherents. There were men who liked being on the winning side and liked the booty, because there's always booty, right? Those of you who've been involved in armies, there's always booty, money to be paid out to them, land. So often there was going to be a significant bit of land that would come to you as part of the army and part of the conquest, because of course new territory was going to be conquered. So that's part of it. Now the other thing is, how do they go forward with an army like this? And how do they go onward and onward and onward, further and further away from home? Well, they had a whole plan for naval support. So this had all been set out ahead of time. There were ports, places at which his great admiral Nearchos, who wrote a book about all this after Alexander was gone, where Nearchos would put in with maybe 100 ships that had all been provisioned ahead of time, and those ships would come into port, and all of that would be provided to the army, and then they could go on. So there's two ways that you kept provisioning your army. And then 3, during the conquest, he was going to conquer treasuries of states. Banks had vaults in those days, and in those vaults they had gold. And gold you could use anywhere. So if you came into Babylon, which of course he will do, and you conquered Babylon, and you conquered the royal treasury of Babylon, in which there would have been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of civil servant workers who were all toting up all the gold, and you just walked in the front door and said, I would like all the gold, that's what they would do. They would just go get it all and bring it to you in wheelbarrows. Here comes the gold. And that meant that you just overnight had an army with a treasury bigger than Babylon. You get it? You see? And so, therefore, you were rich. You were very, very rich. And in some cases, in his case, you became so rich that you never needed funds again. And that is the case in Alexander's conquest of the treasury of the Persians. That when he conquers the treasury of the Persians, which is in Susa, when he conquers the treasury of the Persians, he obtains so much revenue that he never has to worry about it again. He doesn't have to write home to Greece and say, please send me a check, send me a money order, nothing like that. he has money. He has infinite amounts of money